I am one of the fortunate ones that I did get to read an advanced copy which did not have they're just beautiful color photos in the middle. I can't quite do it justice while I'm holding a microphone, but this one in particular just really struck me. Yeah, you should say, oh yeah. But anyways, they're just phenomenal. Real eye candy in there. But in terms of what this book is about, the title kind of describes it. It's an environmental history of the American grasslands, both the tall and short grass prairies, and then the consequences that have come to be as a result of how we've managed or rearranged those landscapes. And fortunately, the book does have, because it can get a little dark in the middle there, but they end with redemption. The arc of the story it leaves us in a good place at the end, so don't worry about that as you read it. There is hope, and we end with those stories of hope. But when I was reading it, one of the things that struck me is that, because I'm an environmentalist, a professional, I've been in the world for a good many years, and I wasn't really sure what I would learn from this or what other people would be able to take away. And it struck me that, well, this book is beautifully written. And so anybody will enjoy reading it just because of the quality of the writing. It pulls you in. And the characters pull you in. But there's stuff in here even for people who would not consider themselves to be an environmentalist. I think anybody who is even has a modicum of interest in food and what they're eating and where their food comes from is going to be very interested in this book. Anybody who's interested just in American history in general is going to be interested in this book. And certainly people who have an interest in the environment will be interested in this book. So I guess that's a way of saying in advance that no matter who you are, you're going to be interested, but probably a lot of people on your gift list will be interested as well.
Good plug.
I want to, before we get started in the questions, I could tell as we were coming in, a lot of people know these two folks. How many of you know either Josephine or Dave? So, all right, so we've got a lot of friends and family here, I think, and former colleagues and tennis mates and all sorts of things. Anyway, let me kind of start in here with some questions. And the obvious first question is, how did this book come to be? How did it originate in your minds, in your, and then taking it from a crazy idea of writing a book to writing a book together and actually pulling it off? So.
Can we give a two-part answer?
Absolutely. Yeah.
First of all, thank you everybody for being here. It's so great. I didn't know the Prairie had so many friends. I didn't know that we had so many friends. But anyway, thank you for coming out. I've been interested in the Prairie for about 20 years. I was an editorial writer at the Star Tribune many years ago, and my wonderful colleague Lori Sturdivant and I, we were always writing editorials about how to save the small town, how to save rural America. And I was driving to work one morning and I thought, maybe we just got it wrong. All of my cousins grew up in small towns, western Minnesota. They all left. They moved to Madison, Chicago, Denver, and they would never go back. You could put in fiber optic cable and high speed. They would never go back. And I just thought, maybe you can't fight the tides of history and the forces of economics. And at that same point, somebody turned me on to a great essay called The Buffalo Commons. Some of you might know it. I really recommend it. It's by There are two wonderful geographers from Princeton who told the history of the plains and as a series of catastrophes, droughts, blizzards, federal bailouts. And they argued we should just let people leave and turn it back to the buffalo. So it's really, really fun. They made it as sort of a joke or a thought experiment. They weren't serious. But anyway, it got me thinking about, were we right as a nation to settle this wild, beautiful land? What do we do to undo the damage that we caused? And how do we make it a good place for the beautiful creatures who used to live there? And then, Josephine wrote a series.
When I became the environmental reporter at the Star Tribune, thought about, okay, so what are the biggest environmental problems that we have in this state? And one of them was for sure agricultural pollution. And so I started doing a lot of reporting on that, and that evolved into looking at the replacement of grasslands and wild places with agriculture. Because the more agriculture you have, the more water pollution and other problems you have. But I came to realize that even though I wasn't really familiar with prairies, I sort of saw them the way everybody else did. That as I talked to the wildlife people and the ecologists and the people who really did work in prairies and did care about prairies, that this was a valuable ecosystem, and I realized our rainforest, in the sense that we are losing something extraordinarily valuable and important for our world, in the same way that we're losing the rainforest, but it's not really widely recognized. And that's sort of what became one of the reasons why I continued to pursue that writing and that reporting, because I just felt it was a really important place, and one that's very important to our history, and not just our history of European settlers, but also Native Americans, and whose culture and whose lives were dependent on that ecosystem. But so I did a lot of that reporting, and then Dave and I used to walk around the newsroom together a lot, and one day he said, let's go for a walk, and he said, do you want to write a book with me? And I said, sure, what's it on? And in my head I'm thinking, that'll never happen. but here we are. So we did we could very quickly realize this was like a project that one could do when retired. We couldn't do it while we were working full time. So when he retired, we put together a book proposal, and we got some very good advice from people in the book world to make it as big as we could. So we put together a proposal that was essentially piggybacked on the series that we had done at the newspaper about the Vanishing Prairie, and turned it into a book proposal, and were able to connect with an agent who sold it to Penguin Random House. So here we are.
And what was it like? I mean, you guys had worked together for a long while, but you weren't really writing together, and it certainly wasn't of the length of a book project. And I know for me reading it, I was trying to figure out who wrote what parts, and I really couldn't. It was in my reading, it was quite seamless. How did you do that?
I'll go first.
Dave and I worked together for a long time, and he edited my copy for a long time, and I edited his edits for a long time.
And we're still friends.
And we're still friends, and we had a pretty similar style and a pretty similar view of reporting and writing. And also we had an editor, when I became the environmental reporter, we had an executive editor who was extraordinarily supportive of us and the work that we did, and he basically let us just do what we wanted, for the most part, as long as we kept producing stories, and as long as Dave managed, half a dozen other reporters as well. So then, they let us do what we wanted, so.
Yeah, it went amazingly smoothly. Josephine's a great reporter, great writer, great traveling companion. There was that big fight we had in the bar in Billings.
Tell. I don't remember that. I don't remember.
That's the kind of writing companion you want, someone who doesn't remember the fights. Yeah. Now, so when you started this, you guys are both very knowledgeable about the subject matter, and of course, the book is so well written that to a reader it seems effortless. You think somebody just sits down and writes this stuff, and even if they had to edit a little bit, they already knew it all. It's just, but I know that it took a lot of research. As you were doing this, what was something, even though you already knew a ton, that really surprised you? That you sort of went, oh, I didn't realize that, or that's really cool. I hadn't really anticipated learning that.
I'll do a really quick one, just because I want to underscore this theme. I didn't know that the prairie and grasslands are a huge buffer against climate change, just invaluable, globally significant. What do grasses do? Grasses absorb carbon dioxide, right? Photosynthesis, they absorb carbon dioxide, they store that carbon deep underground, roots that can go 10 feet underground. Anybody who's ever turned over a shovel full of soil in the Midwest knows it's inky black. Why is it black? That's carbon that's been accumulating there for thousands and thousands of years. And so across the world, the great grasslands, the pampas in South America, the veldt in Africa, these are hugely important buffers against climate change. And if we plow them up, you know, we're just losing that. One friend of ours estimated that just the plowing we've done in the last 10 years or so out west, 1 million acres a year, is the equivalent of adding 11 million cars to the road every year, the climate change equivalent of adding 11 million cars. And it would be so easy just to say, stop, just leave it. I mean, it wouldn't be. There are a lot of people out there at a stake need to make a living and so on. But compared to some of the other climate change solutions, it would be so easy. And it would have a lot of other good benefits too for wildlife and water.
One of the things that I sort of knew, but which was really apparent in doing this book, was that you know, the mountains and the national parks, or the mountain ecosystem and the boreal forest ecosystem, they don't have to compete with farming in order to survive, in order to persist. But the prairies, they have to compete with farming, because that's all over the world. It's in the grasslands and on the flatlands where farming occurs, because that's where the soil is. And so, and I think that really, you know, made me feel as if the prairies were the underdog in our world. So that surprised me, I guess.
Yeah. Let me go back to this concept of climate and the prairie soils. And you know, we tend to think of when we're trying to protect natural systems, to protect the climate, we think about mangroves and rainforests and that sort of thing. And you really make a good case in the book of the role of soil. And I just wonder if you can go, maybe Josephine, kind of add on to what Dave has already said about how soil plays a role in capturing that carbon. Why, when you plow it up, does that carbon disappear? Where does it go? And what can farmers be doing? What can we be doing in our own yards? I mean, because most of us, if we live here, we live on former prairie, and you know, if you've got lawn, it's not putting carbon in the way that a prairie grass would. So, you want to just kind of riff off that for a little bit?
Well, I'm going to say that, I'm going to tell you a secret. That
Okay.
Dave wrote that chapter.
Okay.
So I'm going to let him answer that.
Confession, I became kind of obsessed with soil in the course of this. If you're interested in this stuff, there's a great academic named David Montgomery at University of Washington, and he's written 2 or 3 books about the history of soil and humans' relationship with soil. I mean, did you know that overusing the soil, erosion, destroying the land, contributed to the collapse of the Roman Empire, the early Mesopotamian Empire? There's the great city of Ur, the great ancient city of Ur. It's in the Bible. It was once a port. It was a vital port for the Middle East. It's now 30 miles from the ocean because they let so much land erode and wash in around it. The key thing is, scientists used to talk about soil quality, growing things. Now they talk about soil health, because it's a living thing. It's a living thing. It's full of bacteria and fungi that process the carbon and the carbohydrates that come in from plants. Those roots and tendrils go out and stimulate other growth. It's full of tiny little creatures that eat little bits of wood and process them in a way that turns them into nitrogen or other nutrients that plants can use. And just one little measure, this is a surprise. 1 tablespoon of prairie soil, 1 tablespoon contains so many tiny microorganisms. It's more organisms than the human population on Earth. One tablespoon. One researcher that we talked to, Joe Handelsman, University of Wisconsin, was great, said it's the most complex habitat on Earth. And the residents are little, they're tiny, but there are a lot of them.
So who was the researcher you were talking to, and you said, you asked them a question like, what's more important,
Oh, yeah.
soil or oil? Was that it?
I said, could we think of, because then we wrote a lot about erosion, and we're losing literally millions of dollars a year of priceless topsoil, fertile, wonderful, rich topsoil. Goes erosion, goes into the river, goes down to the Gulf of Mexico. So I was coming to think of soil and its value. This is a guy at the University of Minnesota. We had great help from the farm campus. And I said, could we think of soil as a finite natural resource, like gold or oil? And he just kind of stared at us. He said, it's way more important than oil or gold. We could live without gold or oil.
Oh, very interesting. Hey, as long as we're on this soil thing, I got one more soil question. I'm just fascinated by soil. But I want you to tell the anecdote of, so this book has been getting national attention. So Josephine and Dave have been, kind of doing the circuit on interviews, pre-publishing interviews, our pre-release interview. And one of them was with the syndicated show Here and Now that's put out by WBUR. And so you went down before the release of the book to be interviewed on the prairie down in Illinois by, I forget who the guy was, and
Chris Bentley.
Chris Bentley. And as you were sitting on the plane coming home, tell that story.
Oh, so we were, we're going to Chicago for like an in and out, right? You fly in, you drive to the prairie, you do the interview, you come home. Well, which we did, and we got to the airport, and our plane was delayed. And then, and delayed, as was everything else. And it turns out there was a storm outside, there's a big storm coming, and it was a dust storm. And so they grounded all the planes in Chicago because they can't fly in dust storms. And we're standing there in the terminal looking at, where they have these big windows, seeing this cloud of dirt coming toward us. And that's the dirt from Iowa. I mean, that's what was blowing up against the glass, So it's like, this is like, we're living our book. I mean,
There's another hilarious story. It's in the book.
That story that they just told is not in the book.
When the Dust Bowl hit, the 1930s, just a catastrophe in the Midwest, and FDR was busily trying to think of ways to bail out farmers and save all that beautiful, productive land out there. His head of conservation, whose name I can't remember now, it'll come back, went to testify in Congress to ask for an appropriation to set up what would become the Soil and Water Conservation Service. And there was a bunch of skeptical senators, but he had been getting reports by telegraph from his field researchers out on the prairie. And they told him there was a really big storm. This is at a time when there had been dust storms in Chicago, St. Louis. I mean, big cities were getting blanketed with these dust storms. They told him there's a big storm, and it's a dust storm. It's probably gonna hit the East Coast on, Thursday. So he sort of stalled his testimony. And there are several descriptions of this. Washington, D.C., the mall, the sky turns yellow-purple, the wind is gusting, federal workers leave their offices and go out on the mall to look, and here comes this massive dust storm, and he says, "Senators, there goes Oklahoma."
It's crazy. It's crazy. Okay, so I hope that you guys are getting your questions formulated in your head. I got one more question for these guys before I open it up. And I should tell you, before you ask your question, I don't think Maya mentioned, but this is being recorded, so if that changes what you ask. So when you were, your career was as an editor, obviously there's a lot of editing that goes into making a book, and you had, I'm sure, many more ideas and favorite children that you wanted to include in this. What's one thing that you wish you had to leave out, but it was like, that's hard?
Dung beetles.
We fell in love with dung beetles.
Dung beetles. So there are three kinds. There's rollers, diggers, and what's the third one? I can't remember what the third one is. But anyway, they are, the dung beetles are, critical around the world, not just here, but they're in every ecosystem. And you know what they do is they process dung, and which is a very important, role in the environment. And in the West, and well, everywhere where you have cattle or cows, most ranchers use insecticides on their cows to help manage flies and other bugs, and they put other drugs in their food to manage with parasites in their gut. And these parasites, these insecticides, of course, kill all the dung beetles that are in their pastures. And as a result, one of the big problems is that none of the dung patties get processed as quickly as possible. So there was a lot of research done by some researchers in South Dakota called Ecdysis, which is a nonprofit that does a lot of work on insects, and they really found that if you just don't put insecticides on the cows, then you get a lot more dung beetles, and the farmers, nationally it can save farmers like millions and millions of dollars if they just leave the dung beetles be. But that didn't make it in the book. Sorry.
Next book, yeah.
No, that's good.
Nothing that you had to cut that you're, all right.
The sea of dung beetles.
Yeah. Any questions from?
Maybe it's a pile of them.
A pile, yes. Any questions from out there? Yes.
So I heard on the radio every 7 to 10 days there's a new dystopian novel or film that's released, in which we've gone so far beyond the pale that we can't repair the damage that's already been done, let alone accommodate kind of the new appetite for drilling, more destruction of the natural world. How did you sort of accommodate that reality in this book, and are you able to offer sort of good news in the midst of all the bad news that we're immersed in?
I'm not sure how much of the question picks up for the recording.
It should
that's good. Okay, great.
Did you ever go to everyone else hear it? Okay. Life is too short to go through it without hope. So, and we were very conscious of wanting to make sure that we included people and work that is being done to sort of stop this tidal wave of land conversion. Intensive agriculture is still winning, but I've heard a lot of people say that we're sort of approaching the end of agriculture as we know it because it's not sustainable. Then there are a lot of people out there, and we've had several chapters in the book describing them, that are doing work both in agriculture in terms of doing it differently and in terms of preserving soil and protecting soil and focusing on soil, as well as ranchers who are raising cattle differently and with a focus on raising grass, not cattle. And then people who are doing things like bringing back bison. So, it's one of the researchers we took, the same guy who ran Ecdysis, said, we might be in the middle of a sea change and we just don't know it.
Yeah, it's a great question, Jay, and it is hard to be optimistic at this time. But one of the really great things, and a bit of a surprise, which we kept stumbling upon, was all these people doing great work out there in Iowa, Montana. We have ranchers. Ranchers are often cast as villains because cattle can be bad for the land. There's some truth to that. Farmers, we kept running into ranchers and farmers and others who are doing cool things to change agriculture, reduce erosion, reduce water pollution, save grass, save wildlife, and they're not getting any attention. And so we thought we'd give them a
Do you want to say anything more about, there's a fair amount of the book is on bison and raising bison in a, maybe a, I don't want to say bad way, but a less appetizing way, and then bison that you feel like, oh, that these guys are one with the prairie. This is sort of more, so do you want to describe that kind of? Yeah.
So, 100 years, well, at the turn of the century, there were something like 25 bison in Yellowstone National Park, and a few in Canada. Other than that, they had been pretty much wiped off the continent. after that, they became livestock. I mean, it was as if Americans didn't know what to do with them, so they just turned them into cows, or tried to turn them into cows. And for the next 100 years, they were raised like cows and treated like cows, even though they are, wild animals. And I found that was like a really interesting history. In fact, for a while we thought about doing a book just on sort of the modern day history of bison, but we decided to make it bigger. But I do sort of feel as if, and Dave, we've talked about this a lot, that bison are a symbol in a way of the kind of grasslands we could have in the future. Never mind the poppers, because bison can coexist very well with people and cattle. And they are a keystone species on the grasslands. I mean, the grasslands evolve with them, and they evolve with grasslands, and they're a very important part of keeping the grasslands healthy. They are also, of course, key to the life and livelihood and religion of many Native Americans as well. So one of the people we wrote about is a guy named Dan O'Brien, who runs a company called Wild Idea Buffalo. And he was a biologist by training, and he was a rancher, sort of a failed rancher, and he wrote a book called Buffalo for the Broken Heart. And the broken heart was his ranch, and the buffalo was the animal that he decided to raise instead of cattle that restored both his ranch and his own soul. He now has a small vertically integrated company where he raises wild bison on his land, and then has a process that he calls in-field slaughter, where he takes a semi-tractor trailer truck into a pasture and shoots the buffalo on the grass, and then processes the carcass in the back of the tractor trailer truck, and then takes it to his own slaughterhouse or his own processing facility in Rapid City and sells direct to customers online. So he and his family are powerful proponents of grassland conservation. You should look at their website. It's really more about the place where they live and the beauty of the place where they live and their work to restore grasslands. But I sort of feel like the bison would be sort of the emblem of our book in a way, even though we write about a lot more than that.
We also visited a number of reservations. One of the other very, very cool things we found is that there's been a big growth in tribal bison herds. There's a long story involving Yellowstone National Park, which has the world's largest herd of wild bison. But I'll just cut to the chase. We met an amazing guy named Robert Magnan at the Fort Peck Reservation in Montana. He's head of fish and game there, and he has started bison herds. And now he's made Fort Peck the hub to distribute nearly wild Yellowstone bison to about 25 other reservations. And it's a triple win. You're saving this magnificent animal, and in almost a wild setting. You're saving the grass and repairing the grass, because bison are good for grass. Where bison roam, grass grows better. And then you're salvaging, resurrecting the great history and culture of the Plains tribes. So that was really fun. Although at one point, punchline, I was talking to a naturalist about how hard it is. It's complicated. You need big fences, big pastures. A buffalo can jump a 6-foot fence, kind of without trying, 2,000 pounds. And I said, we've kind of saved the wolf, we've saved eagles, maybe we're saving coyotes. Why is it so hard to save bison? And he said, well, those other animals tend to stay on their own, away from people. He said, a buffalo will come in and look in your living room window. They're friendly, which is dangerous, right?
Yeah. Sounds like you met some really extraordinary people in the process of writing this book who are doing really innovative things. I'm wondering if you know of organizations who are doing things on a bigger scale, or if there are policy recommendations. I'm thinking about places like the Nature Conservancy or Sierra Club. I can just give you my list of donation, Environmental Defense Fund. I mean, who's really looking at this on a bigger scale and helping to make systematic change and protection?
Well, the first one that comes to my mind is the World Wildlife Fund.
Okay.
They have a big program and project to work with ranchers and people who own grassland out west. They're, I think it's the Great Plains Office for the World Wildlife Fund. They're based in Bozeman, and they are. They were enormously helpful with this book, and particularly in terms of connecting us with ranchers who are doing things for grass as well as for cattle. And they, when we talked to them about why are you doing things this way, they said, well, 85% of the Great Plains are owned by ranchers, by people who are private landowners, and so you really can't change or protect what's going on out there without working with landowners themselves. And so that's where, that's where the money is. That's where you have to go to actually do work on the land, and they do a phenomenal job with that.
I would also add the Nature Conservancy, and I know there's some controversy. Some people are a little skeptical of Nature Conservancy, sort of gotten too corporate or something. But we found them doing extraordinary work all over the place. And one very cool example, little surprise, they operate a ranch called Matador Ranch in the middle of Montana, near the Missouri Breaks. And the deal is that neighboring ranchers can come in and graze their cattle on Matador Ranch at discounted grazing fees. Grass is priceless out there. If you have livestock, you pay grazing fees to graze your animals. So the Nature Conservancy set it up so that neighboring ranchers can graze their cattle at Matador Ranch for reduced fees if they commit to a bunch of environmental practices on their home ranch and commit to not plowing up the grass, and they have bird monitoring on the home ranch. And they've gotten tremendous buy-in, from ranchers who would have been, kind of anti-environmental or at least very skeptical. It's a great partnership.
Yeah, so fire is an essential component of a lot of biomes, particularly grasslands. Did you talk about that? Buffalo can sort of replace the effects of fire, but, what's the issues?
We have a great picture of fire on the prairie in the book, but we didn't write about fire, though I know that prairie conservationists use fire a lot. They do controlled burns. My daughter actually used to do controlled burns for the Nature Conservancy, but that was in Florida, not here. But no, we didn't get into that as a topic. It's a problem not just for grasslands, it's a problem for forests. That's why we have these horrible forest fires now, is because there's such a fuel buildup. I don't other than learning how to do fires, in a safe way that protects human property, I don't know that it's ever going to come back in a big way. But what is interesting to me, which is not in the book, but that different parts of the grasslands have a different approach to fire. Like in the Flint Hills, the ranchers down there, they burn every year. It's a big cultural event. It's a big party. It's like Christmas, and they all go out and the whole families go out there with their burn sticks and they set things on fire. Whereas in South Dakota, fire is considered as just a horrible, terrifying thing. It was a really interesting contrast to see those different perspectives.
Yes.
I happened to listen to NPR, and I heard your interview on last week, 2 weeks ago.
On the Here and Now, was it here?
Nina Mooney.
Oh, yeah.
That's Neil Mooney.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I was fascinated with your discussion about how the grasslands were created, geologically created. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit about that. Why did they exist there?
It all has to do with water. So when the mountains rose up, what was the name of that event?
The Laurentide ontogeny?
It's an ontogeny, something like that, which was the geological event that created the Rocky Mountains, the western mountains that we have. That created a rain shadow across the Midwest. So the clouds would come up, the weather would come in from the Pacific Ocean, and and the rain and the weather would run up against the mountains. They would drop all their water on the west side of the mountains, and on the east side then it was always very dry. And the further west you go, the drier it is, which is why the prairie grasses in the west are very short, because it's very dry, whereas the prairie grasses, if we still had them in places like Iowa and Indiana, would be as tall as way over your head. So that's just a difference in the amount of water they get. But Dave was also very good at describing the tiny parts of the grasses. So I'll let him do that.
I'll just go into one tiny little anecdote since we mentioned fire a minute ago. In many cases, it's hard to talk in universal phrases or ideas, but there are many places where the prairie would disappear, left to its own. It would be encroached by woody plants, cedars and other things. And so wildfires were actually a friend of the prairie or a friend of the grasses, because grass can survive a wildfire. 80% of its biomass is underground. It's storing roots, carbohydrates, other nutrients underground, whereas the woodier plants will burn down. And so without fire, we wouldn't have the prairie today. If we hadn't had, thousands of years of wildfires, we wouldn't have a grassy prairie today.
I'm gonna ask a follow-up question on that, sort of like, how did this come? There's a description that you have in the book. I can't remember exactly how it fits into the story, but it was fascinating for me to read how the Red River formed, and as the glaciers melted, and I remember pulling up a satellite photo to try to see what you were talking about. It was like, oh yeah, I can see it. So can you describe that, the role of that? And I don't remember, again, I can't remember how it fit into the book's story. But
Oh, yeah, this was, one of the chapters is called Prairie 2, and it's about the largest prairie restoration in the country, which is in northwest Minnesota at Glacial Ridge National Wildlife Area. I'm always fascinated by the geology and the history of this, but 10,000 years ago or more, there was a giant lake that went from basically the southern Minnesota all the way up into Canada. It was called Lake Agassiz, and it was by far larger than all 5 of the Great Lakes put together. And then it was blocked on the north end by the glaciers, and as the glaciers melted, the lake sort of pushed forward, and then finally the lake pushed through and broke through the glacier wall at sorry, what?
Fargo.
No. It was way north. It was the St. Lawrence. It was the whatever that bay is
Hudson
called.
Bay.
Hudson Bay. Thank you. Sorry. And so then it broke through at Hudson Bay, and the amount of ice and the amount of water that entered Hudson Bay changed global temperatures. It was that cold. And then after that, then the lake drained and it all moved north. And so that created the Red River, which is in the Red River Valley, which is like the silliest name you ever heard, because the drop of land is like 1 foot per mile, and so that's why it's so squiggly. It's a meandering river, and all the rivers in that area are meandering rivers, and they're still cutting down through soil. They haven't quite reached bedrock, which is why they're so muddy. But that river is one of the only rivers major rivers in this country that flows north into Hudson Bay.
It's cool to be able to see that, yeah.
Can you talk about the limitations of groundwater and the irrigation that's converting everything?
Oh, yeah, we can,
Let me just say, we didn't write about the Oglala Aquifer, which is, the biggest problem up there because of irrigation in that part of the western plains. We'll probably lose the Oglala Aquifer within 30 or 40 years. We're draining it 4 times faster than nature can replenish it. But a lot has been written about that, so we sort of left it alone, except it did figure into Josephine's chapter on Glacial Ridge in a very cool way.
the Ogallala.
The water.
Oh, the water. One of the reasons why we didn't write about the Ogallala is because if the Ogallala is a contained aquifer under bedrock, or I don't know what the details are because I never looked at it too deeply, but we figured that, if the Ogallala got drained and dried up, it would be good for the prairie because all the farmers would move away and they would all come back to grass. So, but we didn't write much about groundwater. We wrote a lot about tile drainage. So, and then the contribution that tile drainage under farmland makes to water pollution. I'm blanking.
How did it happen with Glacial Ridge?
Oh, with Glacial Ridge. So that was a project that was initiated by the Nature Conservancy. And, took a long time. They had that part of Glacial Ridge, which is on the edges of the, what is the Red River Valley, or what is the Red River there. The beaches of Lake Agassiz sort of rose up, and there were, created these rolling hills, very low rolling hills, that are mostly sand, because that's what Agassiz left behind. And in between them then there are wet areas which are lower. And so it became an area that was not good for farming, because it was too sandy and then it was too wet. And so over the years they raised a lot of cattle there, and then they tried farming there, but it never worked very well. The only reason why farmers were able to succeed there was because of the Farm Bill, which gave them insurance. And after a while, there was a huge tract of land that had been partially farmed and partially grazed that came up for sale, and the Nature Conservancy bought it with the goal of returning it to grasslands. And at the same time, there were also a number of other parcels there that were that were protected by the state and by the National Wildlife Service. But the Nature Conservancy started this project to bring it back, and they sort of bought the farmland, and they had to work with the community to convince them that this was going to be okay. And so one of the things that they did is they created a trust fund to pay the taxes that would have been paid by the farmers who had lived there. But they were very smart, because they owned the land and they couldn't convert it all to grassland at the same time. They had to do it piece by piece. And so they would rent the land to farmers while they were restoring something else. And then they would use the rent from the farmers to pay for to create the trust fund. And they also had some other businesses up there, I think, that contributed as well. And so just bit by bit, they would take the land and then they would return it to prairie, and then they would pay the farmer off, and then he would kill all his crop with Roundup, and then they would reseed it and into grassland. And over time, it came back. But one of the main reasons why they were able to convince the local community to do this was because the city of Crookston needed a new supply of clean water for drinking. And they knew that if they put their wells here, that water would stay clean forever and would never be contaminated by farm chemicals. So that worked.
Seems like there's some other places in Minnesota that could use something like that. Any other, yeah.
Thank you guys for doing this wonderful research and wonderful book. And I would like to know, given your long-term perspective on this question, I'd like to ask, like you talk a little politics, I'd like to ask you how you see this present moment in Washington and the anti-environmental spirit that seems to be in control right now in Washington, D.C. Do you see this as just another flip of the political pendulum in this country, something that we've seen before and we'll see again? Or are we now seeing something that's a real menace, in part because of when this spirit is arising, given the threat that the prairie is under?
Time will tell. It's a great question, Lori. Conservation in the Farm Bill, it goes back and forth. Every few years, Congress creates a beautiful conservation program. CRP, Conservation Reserve Program, then CSP for working lands. You didn't have to idle the land. You could get a federal subsidy to do good environmental stuff on working farmlands. CREP, EQIP. And then another Congress comes in and they take all the money away. And then 5 years later, they put the money back in, so on and so forth. This time around, even more than the Farm Bill, Biden's IRA, as everybody knows, it was way more than inflation reduction. It included a lot of money for what they call smart agriculture, climate smart agriculture, resilient agriculture, a lot of subsidies. Because if a farmer is going to take a risk to plant some novel crop or buy a novel piece of machinery or put a cover crop, they need a little help. It's a big risk. You borrow $1 million. We talk to farmers who borrow $1 million in the spring just to put their crop in the ground. And if you lose 50 acres, you're in trouble. So that was in. There are a lot of subsidies in the IRA, and Trump has pretty much rolled those back. And it might change. I guess the discouraging thing is that we've lost 4 or 5 years in the battle against climate change. And we can't afford to lose 4 or 5 years in that.
I think that one advantage is that, for a lot of people in Washington, this part of the country is flyover land. And that a lot of the work that's being done can fly under the radar, if you will, in terms of their interest of people in Washington. Also, a lot of work is being done at state and local level. Particularly Minnesota is a classic example of that. And I think that there are a lot of people who own land who are doing work on their land and changing it back into something more wild, and farmers who are very concerned and interested in soil health and in controlling runoff. And it's kind of a cultural shift, or you need a paradigm shift and sort of to make that happen. But I think that can happen without Washington, or is happening without Washington.
And maybe you could say a little bit about the Forever Green project that you include in the book.
Are any of you familiar with that phrase, Forever Green? It's a project at the University of Minnesota on the St. Paul campus. Just a little bit of history. What do ag campuses do over decades? They invent new crops, right? The Honeycrisp apple, the Zestar apple. I didn't know this until we started working on the book, but scientists at the St. Paul campus 50, 60 years ago invented a hybrid grass seed that would grow well in northern Minnesota, a part of the state it was very hard to do farming, very hard to do anything else, but all of a sudden now there's a big sod business in north central Minnesota because of a hybrid that was created at the St. Paul campus. Their latest project is not just to make more money for farmers, but to make environmentally friendly crops that will also turn a profit for a farmer. Don Wise, the wonderful guy who died recently, who led Forever Green, he said, if a farmer can't make money off it, he or she won't plant it. So you've heard of Kernza. Kernza is this perennial wheat. It was invented in Kansas at the Land Institute, but the U of M St. Paul campus is a major testing site, development site. And they have a bunch of other, I think 13 other crops now, camelina, pennycress. There's some talk about one of these could be a winter oil seed, and then you turn the oil into jet fuel. All the airlines are desperate for green fuel. Is it going to work? I don't know, but they're trying to do that, and it's pretty great work. It's interesting work.
Yeah, it's really cool work. If you ever get a chance to take a tour of their fields, it's well worth it. Any other hands out here
Just had a question, the prairie doesn't stop at the border. Have you guys explored at all what Canada might be doing, or in all their prairies?
That's one of the parts we left out. We didn't, but I will say we kept stumbling upon cool experiments. Bison herds, woodland bison, grass protection happening in Canada. Maybe that's our next book, but it was beyond our remit to get up there.
But I was just thinking about some of the big things that you've talked about in the book, the tile drainage, the bison, the perennial crops that can be part of the turning things around. One thing that hasn't come up in our discussion so far today, but is kind of a big concept, is what's coming off of the prairies and the agricultural lands, and how it's impacting the Gulf of Mexico. And it's always kind of struck me as ironic that we get farmers feel like they got to max everything out because they're feeding the world with corn and soybeans, but meanwhile, we're supposed to be feeding the world with fish and shellfish from the Gulf of Mexico, and we're killing it all. Not to mention what might be in the Mississippi River itself. But can you just want to say anything about the Gulf of Mexico, or how we're, is there any hope for the dead zone, the changes that are happening up here that might,
Well, not in the near term. So the dead zone is created by agricultural pollution, nitrogen and phosphorus, though mostly nitrogen, that comes off the fields because nitrogen is what they call very slippery. And farmers have a tendency to apply too much because we all are applying fertilizer in our gardens. We want a little bit more, maybe we'll get more plants, and they do that on a regular basis. The other thing is that it's really difficult to understand, for farmers to understand how much they should apply and how much will stay on with their crop and how much flows off. But the consequence of that is that we have a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico that varies in size from, I don't know, the size of Rhode Island to the size of Massachusetts every year. And it's a place where the nutrients create algae on the surface, and then there's a biological process that takes oxygen out of the water, so that nothing can live in those dead zones. And as a result, the shrimping industry and the fishing industry in the Gulf has really been hurt, though they've been hurt by far more by imports of shrimp and other shellfish from other countries. The other part, which is the story that we focused on a lot, is the consequence on the Mississippi coast when the Army Corps of Engineers opens what they call the Bonnie Carré Spillway near New Orleans, which is a flood control project that they opened. They were supposed to open only 10 times in 100 years or something like that, but it's opened half a dozen times or 4 times since in the last few years, because we have so much water coming off the land from climate change and also tile drainage. And as a result, that polluted water flows through Lake Pontchartrain and then east up the coast of Mississippi, where it's destroyed the oyster beds permanently from the fresh water and the pollution. So that's it's a smaller thing than the Gulf of Mexico, but it seems much more real because that oyster industry was what those Gulf communities and Biloxi was based on. That's why those cities were based there, and that's how those cultures and communities evolved. So the oysters might come back, but they have a lot of problems in addition to the unpredictable flooding. Yes.
Is there a call to action? Are there things that we should be doing in our lives that would make a difference, whether small or significant?
It's so hard with the politics we have now to think that we can do anything. There are so many problems that we have to, that we're worried about. I think the
But you need to give us some hope, okay?
I'm thinking about it, I'm trying. A lot, depends on how, what food are you buying? Are you focused on buying food that,
Grass-fed beef.
grass-fed beef with bison would be another one. Trying to avoid, corn, trying to avoid things that support the corn industry. Because that's really what's replacing grasslands is corn.
No, but corn's in so many things.
Right.
It's ethanol and it's, so we're still allowed to eat corn on the cob, right? Because that's different.
We're allowed to eat corn on the cob. So, one of the other things I think about is, we tend to think of agriculture as being very polluting and that people who, that farmers are, the cause of this problem, but they don't really do anything differently than we do. Do you know what your watershed is? Do you know what's polluting your watershed? Do you know where it comes from? A lot of it's probably coming from your yard. If you have lawns, anybody here have a lawn? Anybody have a lawn service? That's essentially the same thing that, we're doing exactly the same thing that farmers are doing. We're using fertilizer and pesticides on our lawn to keep it green. Do we need a lawn? No, we don't. But, we do need agriculture in one form or another. So, that's not much, but that's a place to start.
Dave, you want to add anything to that? No.
And, vote for people who are going to do something good to the farm bill.
Yeah. We'll take, a couple more questions.
I just might add on to that. Did you run into in your research or any direct sort of drastically negative forces that either wanted to shut you down or work against you, or that were clearly not just by the fact that the economy is set up in a way that farmers have to live in a certain way, but we're actively against what this book stands for and is reporting on?
You mean working against us
That
personally,
or in is corporate agriculture a big
Is Monsanto after you?
All right, wait, they're having a little sidebar conversation here. You need to vocalize that.
Many of you have heard of the American Farm Bureau. It's the largest trade group that represents farmers. and it's the more conservative of the two. There's the Farmers Union, which is the more left-leaning than Farm Bureau. In Iowa, the Iowa Farm Bureau is bigger than the National Farm Bureau. It has something like $12 billion in assets. Because years ago it started a little insurance branch. These are co-ops, back in the last century when farmers couldn't get insurance, couldn't buy seed collectively. And so many of the farm bureaus started a little insurance operation. The Iowa Farm Bureau's insurance operation became extremely successful. Their CEO, the CEO of the Iowa Farm Bureau is paid, $300,000 a year and so on. In Iowa, their newspaper has a bigger circulation than the Des Moines Register. I mean, everything's changed, that's sad, but, and they have an agent to sell insurance and other stuff in every county in Iowa. So if you run afoul of a farm bureau in Iowa, they can squash you like a bug. But let me make it clear, we are not anti-farmer. We write a lot of things that are critical of agriculture today. We're not critical of farmers. We met great farmers, wonderful farmers. And as Josephine alluded to a minute ago, they're kind of caught up in a system that's not of their own making. They can't really control the seed that they buy because it's Monsanto, it's giant conglomerates. They can't really control the crops that they want to grow. If you want to, one thing that's really healthy for the land is to diversify your crops. The way we used to do it 100 years ago. You raise barley, oats, flax, etc. Farmers can't do, we met any number of farmers. I love to grow oats, I can't sell them. There are no more oat mills. There's going to be one in Albert Lee coming soon. But, so I would say that. The other big thing in terms of forces, bad forces, I'm just going to say ethanol. Ethanol. And if something you want to do, call to action, write Betty McCollum, write Elon, write your member of Congress, and try to scale back ethanol. It's sold as a green fuel. I won't go into all the math, and it's complicated. But the short answer is that ethanol has so driven up the demand for corn since 2007, which drove up the price of corn. Corn has been above $4 a bushel ever since that first renewable fuels bill passed. And when corn is above $4 a bushel, most farmers in this part of the country can make money. And why wouldn't you? I mean, if you knew I'm going to get $4 a bushel for my corn, I'm going to plant corn. And I'm going to plow up more and more grass. So it turns out that the destruction of grass and wetlands to plant more corn offsets any environmental benefit from producing a so-called green fuel.
But it does sound like one little thing that we can do that could eventually add up. You're saying so-and-so wants to grow oats, but I can't sell them. So the more we do with our own purchasing to create markets for other kinds of grains is a good thing, I guess. But let me,
Just to your point, Lynn, in terms of, it's very frustrating. What can I do? What can I do? We asked ourselves the question a zillion times. This is a very sort of crude, simple answer, but I would say shop at the co-op, and maybe everybody here does already. Not because we're all organic or we're all whatever, but I would say that in general, at the co-op, they are a little closer to the food producers. They're a little more likely to be working with somebody who's raising beef in a good way, raising pork or lamb in a good way, who's maybe growing kernza and selling it. In my impression is they're a little closer to the producers who care about the land and a little less likely to sell a lot of corn and soybean junk.
well, maybe I think it's time to start. Okay, we'll take one more question, and then it's
Actually, a comment
Oh,
on
okay.
individual contributions, what you can do on a small scale is, we have an organic lawn service, and they don't use chemicals to kill weeds, they're using, of course, sadly, corn gluten
yeah.
and liquid iron. So I mean, that's something that individuals can do at their own home too.
Yeah. No, okay.
One more. Dave, hasn't the science of soil health proven that crop rotation is the healthiest way for farmers to go? And despite that, farmers persist in single more money in it.
Yeah, exactly true. On the latter point, again, we're not anti-farmer. We met farmers who want to have a diverse crop rotation, in many cases the way their mom and dad did. They grew oats for the horses, they grew barley, they raised some pigs, maybe milked a few cows. So many of them would like to diversify, and they can't. As I said a minute ago, I'd like to grow oats or peas or barley, and there's nowhere to sell it. I don't want to blame Cargill per se, but the big grain merchants, that's where you're gonna, and the disappearance of the local farm elevator. I mean, you all remember, you drive through rural Minnesota, every town had a grain elevator. And I didn't know anything about it, I'm a city kid, but if you're a farmer, you don't want to drive all the way to Shakopee to deliver your grain to the Minnesota River, to the barges. It's a lot of time, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of fuel. You need a local grain elevator. And in the old days, those grain elevators would buy a variety of grains. And now the grain elevators have disappeared. Well, Paul Wellstone went on the warpath about this, did a big thing on this to try to restore small grain elevators so that farmers would have more choice, more market power. And it's just hard. There is research, there's Dave Tillman with the U of M. There's great research on this subject. Diverse crop rotations, fascinating topic. But a guy named Dave Tillman at the St. Paul campus, really famous in the field, some of you have heard of him, proved that just slightly diversifying, every second year you put in barley or alfalfa, soil nutrients went up, soil erosion went down, soil life, microorganisms became richer, the soil held more water during the dry summer months. Magical results from a very simple change.
This is, we could keep going for quite a while, but I am gonna start to draw it to a close. I understand there is, in addition to the hardback copy, you have an audio version of the book. You all did not record it, right? You have a professional voice doing that.
Much better than ours.
Well, and it could come out, you otherwise you wouldn't, I don't know when you would have time to do that. But what's next for you guys? Do we get another book, or what do you?
Oh, we actually have something funny. That was a planted question.
Yeah.
We have a little riff on this because
So
we know that everybody out there is wondering, what are Dave and Josephine going to do next? And we have a brilliant publicist at Random House, Marnie Folkman. She's been so great. And she sort of asked us that a few weeks ago. And I said, Hollywood, man. We want Harrison Ford and Meryl Streep. Well, Marnie picked up the bait. And Josephine.
So this is her summary of the screenplay yet to come. Meryl is the no-nonsense soil scientist who left D.C. after her agency caved. Harrison is the ex-rancher who has been secretly replanting native grasses for 20 years. They reunite to save the last square mile of unplowed prairie. There's a buffalo, a fire, a kiss, a Supreme Court hearing. We call it the depth of the roots. And then she goes on and she says, because then, Dave was riffing with her and saying, okay, all the other ranchers are shooting at him. He says, no, he hasn't betrayed the other ranchers. He's protecting them. The rifle shots are coming from the fertilizer lobby. Meryl drags him into the tall grass, presses a bleeding hand to his chest and whispers, the soil remembers. Cute flashback, controlled birds, childhood buffalo encounter, congressional hearing gone wrong. Final shot, a single milkweed sprouting through the cracked asphalt of an abandoned ethanol plant. Anyways, that's Marty, our brilliant young publicist.
But, so anyways, thank you, Dave and Joseph. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for being here with us this evening. Thank you to Majors and Quinn for hosting us and for hosting so many other wonderful authors. You guys are just a great asset for our community and for book lovers everywhere. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you for coming.